When we look at policies and how these policies might impact our barley market at the moment and maybe in the future, it's important to not only look at policies directly linked to barley, but also at policies linked to wheat or maybe even corn. This shows the grain ending stocks globally. And this clearly shows that since 2006-7 more or less, we are in a range of 20%, or let's say 17 to 22% stocks to use ratio. And this is exactly the point of time since when we have a high fluctuation or high volatility in prices. So I think this is very closely related. We have relatively low stocks, and even the two last record high crops cannot prevent from this situation. I think if we would have 1-2 disaster crops again from now, we would suddenly be in a very bullish sentiment again with very low stock-to-use ratios like we had in 2010 or 2007 or so. If we look how protection around the world has developed over the last 3 years, 20 years for producer production, but only few years for consumer production, to which I come later, then we see that the overall protection level in the world is certainly decreasing. This is a very nice measurement of the OECD. They have developed a measure which shows how much of producer earnings is directly linked to governmental support. And here it is shown that in the end of the 80s, we were at 38%. That means 38% of the farmer's income came from the government, more or less. Now we are just at 18%. Now we come to the current situation. When we look at Ukraine, I remember 1 year ago, when the crisis started, everybody thought, oh, now the exports will not be possible anymore from Ukraine, logistically, from a macro political point of view, and so on. You can see that the area which is controlled by Russia, more or less at the moment, covers only, I would say, 10% of total Ukrainian exports. We are at a record high pace for total grains, that is for corn, wheat, and barley. So exports are running very well, very smoothly, practically better than they ever did before. When we look at Russia, I think we have to look at what potential impact might the export duty have. Since February 1, it's 15% plus €7.50. So, but also here, we see that until the middle of January, and this is now not grains, but wheat, we were also on a record high track. 18.5 million tons were exported. This is almost 80% of the total expected total export volume for the season. Argentina, where policy has not changed very much over the last years, but I think it's one of the two main areas of the world, besides the Black Sea area, where trade policy affects the barley market the most. We still have very unpredictable and arbitrary approval of export licenses for wheat, and this has certainly supported barley production over the last years, maybe combined with new marketing opportunities in these countries. So if we sum that up, if we look at purely trade measures, like export restrictions, or like producer protection, import duties on something like that, I think we are clearly on a liberalizing trend around the world. I looked at the WTO page, and we have more than 200 free trade agreements around the world, and I have listed them here in this slide, and I want to quickly go with you through some of these free trade agreements and how I see them. The closest to us is the EU-Ukraine at the moment. It will start in 2016. However, since last year already, we have preliminary measures in place. A quota of 950,000 tons for wheat, 400,000 tons for corn, and 250 for barley, all for zero tariff. I think from a macro political point of view, this is connecting the Ukraine closer to the EU again. The next one, which is interesting and had gained a lot of attraction attention over the last years is the EU-Canadian free trade agreement. That's not yet in place, maybe in 2016. The most interesting point for me is wheat. There we have a quota of 100,000 tons for the next 7 years, so it's very long-term with what we are talking about, at zero tariff, and from then onwards we will have no tariff at all anymore. When it comes to barley, duties are phased out, and Canada will liberalize its exports completely, except for malting barley. There it's at the beginning 95%, and that will gradually decrease over the years. The EU-US free trade agreement, TTIP, the EU Commission is really speeding up this process. They have every 2 months a negotiation round, and I think their target is really to still conclude that in 2016. Many people say it will also depend on another free trade agreement, which is the US and East Asian free trade agreement, which seems to be much further advanced in terms of negotiations. Many people say that this agreement, which seems to be concluded first, might be an indicator for the EU and US free trade agreement. Then we have free trade agreements in place with the Andean countries, with Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, completely liberalized trade from here to these countries. EU-Mercosur is already under negotiation since 14, 15 years. It has been pushed back. EU farmers, and I think also Irish farmers, fear a lot that we will have very competitive meat from these countries, from South America. So then we have EU and Asian, which might be very interesting, and some of you also, I think, can tell more about that. For malt, because there seems to be a big push, most of all for malt, to reduce market access barriers in this area from the EU to these countries. The most interesting, from my point of view, is the Australian and Asian, or the Australian and Chinese free trade agreement. At the moment, there are free trade agreements in place with several Asian members from an Australian point of view, and now it is planned that the Australian and Chinese, or that China will reduce its import quota for barley, for Australian barley, which is only 3% at the moment, but nevertheless, if you reduce that to zero, that means another €6 per ton or something like that, and which will put Australia, besides the freight, at another competitive advantage via the EU. You can see that, especially over the last 12 to 18 months, the EU has developed as a very, very important supplier of barley to China. For some time, there was almost no export from the European Union to China at all. Now, or over the last year, it was partly 450,000 tons per month, and even more than from Australia. So I think this is very interesting to watch over the next months and years, once this reduction of the import duty of China towards Australian barley will have taken place.